You woke up because you couldn't feel your feet. The blanket you'd been sharing with your three siblings was so thin you could see through it in places. Your breath came out in white clouds. Ice had formed on the inside of the window overnight, thick frost patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't a reminder of how cold it was. You could hear your mother moving around downstairs, trying to get the fire started with damp wood that wouldn't catch. Your father had been gone since before dawn, walking 2 miles to the factory where he worked 14-hour shifts. He'd left in the dark and the cold because stopping meant losing the job. You pressed closer to your brother, trying to steal warmth from his small body. He was shivering so hard his teeth chattered. Your sister, the youngest at 3 years old, had stopped shivering during the night. That's when you knew something was wrong. You touched her face. It was cold, too cold. You shook her, called her name. She didn't respond. Your mother heard you and came running up the stairs. She pulled your sister into her arms, rubbing her limbs, trying to warm her, but you already knew. You'd seen it before. Last winter, the neighbor's baby. 2 winters ago, your grandmother. Cold didn't just make you uncomfortable. Cold killed. And in the winter of 1852, in a tenement building in Manchester, your 3-year-old sister had just become another casualty of living without heat. The 18 and early 1900s saw the vast majority of people living without any effective heating. The wealthy had fireplaces in multiple rooms, servants to tend them, and enough coal to keep fires burning constantly. Everyone else had one fireplace or stove if they were lucky, and barely enough fuel to keep it going for a few hours a day. Poor families in cities lived in tenement buildings with thin walls, broken windows, and no insulation. Cold came through every gap. Wind whistled through cracks in the walls. Heat from a single fire barely warmed one room, and even that heat escaped quickly. You couldn't heat the whole house. You couldn't heat the bedrooms. You went to bed cold and woke up cold and spent the hours in between trying not to freeze to death. Winter killed thousands every year. The very young and the very old died first, then the sick, then the malnourished. Cold weakened your body's defenses, made you susceptible to disease, pneumonia, influenza, bronchitis. These diseases thrived in cold, damp conditions, and once you got sick, there was no warm place to recover, no way to give your body the rest and warmth it needed to fight the infection. You just got sicker until you either recovered or died. Most died. Margaret Keating lived with her family in a 3-room tenement in Glasgow. Her father worked in a shipyard. Her mother took in sewing. They had 6 children. Margaret was the oldest at 12. The family's entire heating source was a small coal stove in the main room. Coal was expensive. They could afford maybe 1 bucket a week. That meant the fire burned for a few hours in the evening, then went out overnight. The bedrooms had no heat at all. Margaret and her siblings slept 2 or 3 to a bed under whatever blankets and coats the family owned. It was never enough. Winter nights in Scotland were brutal. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. The tenement walls were damp from condensation and poor construction. Mold grew in corners. The windows didn't seal properly. Wind came through constantly. Margaret would lie awake at night, too cold to sleep, listening to her younger siblings cry from the cold. Her baby brother, only 6 months old, slept between their parents, the only spot in the house with any warmth from body heat. But even that wasn't enough. The baby developed a cough in November. By December, he was struggling to breathe. Pneumonia, probably. There was no doctor. Doctors cost money the family didn't have. Margaret's mother tried home remedies, warm compresses, herbal teas, prayers. Nothing worked. The baby died in January. He was 7 months old. The cold had killed him as surely as any disease. Daily life in winter was a constant battle against the cold. You'd wake up and your clothes would be stiff from the cold. You'd dress as fast as possible, layering everything you owned. Multiple shirts. 2 pairs of socks if you had them. Coats worn indoors because there was no heat to make taking them off practical. You'd go downstairs if your family had a fire going, huddle near it for a few minutes of warmth. Then you deface the day. If you had to work outside, you'd freeze. If you worked in a factory, it might be slightly warmer from the machines, but often factories had no heat either. You de-work all day with numb fingers and aching joints. Come home to a house barely warmer than outside. Eat a cold meal or one heated just enough to be edible. Then go to bed knowing you'd spend the night shivering. Margaret's hands were always cold. She developed chilblains, painful swelling and sores from repeated exposure to cold. Her fingers would crack and bleed. Simple tasks like sewing or holding a spoon became painful. Her feet were worse. She had one pair of shoes with holes in the soles. Walking to school in the snow meant her feet got soaked and stayed wet all day. She couldn't feel her toes most of the time. By her second winter in the tenement, she developed permanent nerve damage from frostbite. There was no escape from the cold. Rich people could retreat to warm homes with multiple fires, thick carpets, heavy curtains, insulated walls. Poor people just endured. You couldn't pay for more coal. You couldn't afford better housing. You couldn't even afford proper winter clothes. Margaret's family wore the same thin garments summer and winter. Coats were patched and repatched until they were more patched than original fabric. Blankets were sewn together from scraps. Nothing was ever warm enough. Margaret's mother would stuff newspapers into gaps in the walls trying to block the wind. It barely helped. The cold was inescapable. It shaped everything. How long you could work. How well you slept. How long you'd live. Families would huddle together in one room in the evening. Everyone pressed close around the stove, trying to capture every bit of heat before bed. Then you'd separate to freezing bedrooms and lie awake, too cold to sleep, conserving energy because moving generated more cold than warmth. Some families kept their children home from school in the worst weather because sending them out meant risking death from exposure. Margaret walked to school every day because education was the only hope for a better future, but she couldn't concentrate in class. Her hands were too cold to write. Her body used all its energy just staying alive. Learning was secondary to survival. If you were Margaret, 12 years old and sleeping in a room so cold that ice formed on the walls, watching your siblings suffer, knowing that winter might kill any of you, how would you have coped? What would you have told yourself to make it through another frozen night? Winter injuries and deaths were so common they barely registered. Newspapers reported dozens of people found frozen to death every winter, in doorways, in alleys, in their own homes. The very poor, the homeless, the elderly living alone. Cold killed indiscriminately. Margaret's neighbor, an old woman who lived alone, was found dead in her room in February. She'd frozen to death sitting in her chair. She'd run out of coal days earlier and had no money to buy more. No one had checked on her. She died alone, slowly freezing, unable to do anything about it. Her body wasn't discovered until the smell alerted neighbors. This happened constantly. Cold claimed victims every single day, and society treated it as normal, acceptable, the price of poverty. Newspapers might note the deaths, maybe express brief sympathy, then move on. No systemic changes, no efforts to provide fuel or heating to the poor. Just acceptance that some people would freeze to death every winter and that was simply how things were. But here's what makes it even more cruel. The resources existed to prevent these deaths. Coal was plentiful. Britain was mining millions of tons annually. The wealthy burned it freely, keeping their homes comfortable, even luxurious. But coal wasn't distributed to those who needed it. It was sold at prices the poor couldn't afford. A bucket of coal that might have saved a child's life cost more than a day's wages for many families. And the coal merchants, the mine owners, the industrialists who controlled the fuel supply, they made fortunes while people froze. Some cities had charitable coal funds that provided minimal amounts to the very poorest. But these were inadequate, poorly funded, and came with conditions. You had to prove you were deserving. Had to demonstrate good moral character. Had to accept lectures about thrift and hard work from people who'd never been cold a day in their lives. And even if you qualified, you get maybe one bucket of coal, enough for a few hours of heat, not enough to survive a winter. The system was designed to let poor people suffer, to keep them desperate and compliant. Because if you were warm and comfortable, you might not accept whatever wages and working conditions were offered. Cold kept the working class afraid, kept them willing to take any job, endure any abuse just to earn enough for fuel. Think about how easy it is to be warm today. Turn up a thermostat, flip a switch. Heat fills the room in minutes. Now imagine that gone. Imagine spending months so cold that you can't sleep, can't think, can't function. Imagine watching your children suffer and knowing you can't help them. That was the reality for millions of people, not in some distant medieval past, in the industrial age, in modern cities, while the wealthy lived in comfort literally blocks away. Could you have survived it? Would you have wanted to? Most families didn't survive winter intact. Someone died, a child, an elderly parent, sometimes multiple family members. Margaret's family lost 3 siblings over 5 winters, the baby in the first winter, a brother aged 4 in the third winter, a sister aged 6 in the 5th winter, all from complications related to cold, pneumonia, influenza, diseases that thrived in cold, weakened bodies. Each death destroyed a piece of Margaret's mother. Each winter became a terrifying countdown. Will we all make it through? Who will we lose this year? Margaret's father became desperate. He took extra shifts when available, trying to earn money for coal and food, but the extra work weakened him. He developed a chronic cough, then lung disease from years of cold and damp. By the time Margaret was 16, her father could barely work. The family's income dropped. They had even less for coal and food. The situation spiraled. Less money meant less heat. Less heat meant more illness. More illness meant less ability to work. The cycle was inescapable. Margaret herself developed chronic respiratory problems. Years of sleeping in freezing rooms damaged her lungs permanently. She coughed constantly, had difficulty breathing, couldn't do physical labor without getting winded. When she tried to find work at age 14, employers rejected her. Too sickly, too weak. She ended up doing piecework at home, sewing for pennies. Work that kept her sitting in the cold tenement, her damaged lungs struggling with each breath, barely earning enough to contribute to the family. She knew she was dying slowly. The cold had weakened her so thoroughly that her body couldn't recover. She developed pneumonia the winter she turned 17. Her mother tried to care for her, but there was no heat, no medicine, no way to give Margaret what she needed to fight the infection. Margaret spent 2 weeks in bed, fever climbing, lungs filling with fluid. She couldn't breathe lying down, had to sit propped up, gasping for air. Her family watched helplessly. They couldn't afford a doctor, couldn't afford to heat the room, could only watch as she suffocated slowly. Margaret died on a February morning. She was 17 years old. She'd spent her entire conscious life being cold, had watched 3 siblings die from the same cold that was killing her, had suffered for years with cold-damaged lungs and frostbitten hands, and the knowledge that poverty meant freezing. Her body was buried in a pauper's grave. Another winter casualty. Another preventable death that no one prevented because preventing it would have required giving poor people access to resources the wealthy wanted to keep for themselves. Margaret's death changed nothing. Her family continued to struggle. Winter continued to kill. The coal kept flowing to those who could pay while those who couldn't froze in tenements and hovels and on the streets. The system continued for decades, not because people didn't know about the deaths, not because solutions didn't exist, but because society had decided that poor people's suffering was acceptable, that their deaths were the price of maintaining an economic system that benefited the wealthy. Newspapers occasionally ran stories about the horrors of winter for the poor. Reformers gave speeches. Charitable organizations collected small amounts of fuel to distribute, but nothing systemic changed. No laws requiring landlords to provide heat. No programs ensuring everyone had access to fuel. No recognition that housing people in buildings that became death traps in winter was fundamentally wrong. The cold killed tens of thousands every year, and that was considered normal. The cost of poverty, the natural order. Even when heating technology improved, when central heating and better insulation became available, these improvements went to the wealthy first. Poor families continued living in the same cold tenements with the same inadequate heating well into the 20th century. Margaret died in the 1860s, but families were still freezing to death in similar conditions in the 1930s. The technology existed to solve the problem. The resources existed. The knowledge existed. What didn't exist was the will to extend those benefits to everyone. Because keeping the poor cold kept them desperate, kept them working for low wages, kept them too focused on survival to organize or demand better conditions. Cold was a tool of control, and it worked exactly as intended for over a century. The legacy remains. Today, people still die from cold, homeless people freezing on streets, elderly people unable to afford heating bills, families choosing between heat and food. The mechanisms have changed, but the underlying calculation is the same. Some people's comfort matters more than other people's lives. That's what Margaret's death taught. That society is willing to let people freeze when saving them would require redistributing resources from the wealthy to the poor. She died because coal was more valuable as a commodity than her life was as a human being. And that equation, that calculation that some lives are worth less than others, that's still operating, still deciding who gets to be warm and who freezes, still killing people who could have been saved if we decided their lives mattered enough. Margaret froze to death at 17, but the system that killed her is still here, still cold, still lethal, still counting certain deaths as acceptable costs of maintaining inequality. And until we confront that truth, until we decide that everyone deserves the basic dignity of warmth, the cold will keep claiming victims. Keep proving that progress means nothing if it doesn't reach everyone. Keep reminding us that the past isn't really past when its cruelties continue in new forms. Margaret deserved better. We all do.